John Ross is a demographer with 30 years' experience in the fields of fertility and reproductive health. Dr. Ross has served as resident advisor to the governments of Indonesia, Korea, and Turkey, and has worked in numerous countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He has published extensively and co-produced a series of statistical collections of international demographic and program data. He often writes popular explanations of complex scholarly issues for a wider audience, and this brief article on the idea of a demographic dividend is a good example of that work. Originally highlighted in technical papers by economists for the most part, the demographic dividend represents another way the passing through the demographic transition affects the societies that experience it. Describe the demographic transition as a process that moves forward through successive stages. Each stage features new relations between birth and death rates in particular, from high rates through mortality and then fertility decline to stable low rates at the end of the process. Each new stage is usually seen as irreversible. That is, once birth rates go down, they're never likely to go back up again to pre-transition levels. But one of the interesting consequences of passage through these transition stages for any society is that an important population characteristic goes through a temporary change, which then reverts in some ways back to its original state as the society leaves the demographic transition behind. That population characteristic is the ratio of dependents at young and old ages to the working age population. During the transition period, a society enjoys what has been called a demographic dividend. To understand what this dividend is and how it comes about, we need to look more closely at how fertility decline affects population age structure. The early transition stage of mortality decline can affect the age structure of a population, but this effect is only minor. After all, death rates can be prevented at all ages, so the effect of any mortality decline is diffused over the whole age range in the population. But when fertility declines, only one age is affected, exact age 0, or the moment of birth. Lower birth rates for women at any ages translate into fewer people in the population of babies found in the first year of life before age 1. When fertility continues to decline steadily for several years or even decades, even if the number of women in childbearing ages is increasing because of past high birth rates, the new lower birth rates will cancel out that larger number of women to stabilize the annual number of babies born. Eventually, the lower birth rates can even begin to produce smaller annual birth totals in absolute terms. The age pyramid of a country like Russia reveals several historical episodes of such lower birth totals. For example, Russia's 2016 age pyramid shows a huge bite taken out of the population at ages 70 to 74. These people would have been born during the Second World War, when birth rates were severely disrupted by conflict and separation. The echo of this wartime interruption of fertility appears as another bite out of the population at ages 45 to 49. These people born in the late 1960s also form a small birth cohort, but not due to any strange circumstances in the country in those years. There were just fewer people at the prime ages for childbearing for a few years, so fewer babies were born. The echo of the earlier bite from World War II. However, we see a narrowing of the age pyramid starting for people in their late 20s and extending down to the bottom of the chart, and this trend of smaller and smaller birth cohorts represents a steep, longer-term drop in the birth rate, not just a temporary disruption due to extreme events like war. This is the pattern that produces a demographic dividend. The arrival of the demographic dividend can be reliably measured by calculating a common summary measure from the distribution of the population over the range of different ages. To calculate the youth dependency ratio, we count up all the people under age 15 or age 19 or whatever age we choose as the dividing line between young dependents who must be supported by parents or other adults, and productive adult ages when people are generally earning wages or salaries in the paid labor force. The decline of this child or youth dependency ratio tells us that the demographic dividend is beginning to appear. We call it a dividend because fewer children per working age adult means that each adult faces lower demands on average for intergenerational transfers of support to that smaller number of young dependents. This lower burden of support extends not only to cash expenditures, but also to commitments of time and attention. The money and time and attention that are freed up from the demands of support for children are all available for new forms of investment in economic growth and rising standards of living for the adult generation. Such increases in living standards, in turn, can create more opportunities for people that may lead them to further reduced fertility, as we know happened in Japan. New reductions in birth rates will lead to even smaller future birth cohorts, which will then place even smaller demands for support on the parental generation. In terms of promoting ongoing fertility decline, this mutually reinforcing process of lower birth rates, a lighter burden of support for adults, additional investments and growth is often described as a virtuous cycle, the opposite of a vicious cycle that locks in a trend in a negative direction. For example, in the United States, the birth rate declined throughout most of the 20th century. As a result, the ratio of young dependents under the age of 20 to adults between ages 20 and 70 also declined throughout most of the century. The only exception to this steady reduction in the youth dependency burden for American society came shortly after mid-century, in the shape of the baby boom. For almost 20 years, this sudden flood of children restored the level of youth dependency to levels not seen since near the beginning of the century. This period was the opposite of a demographic dividend, though we don't really have a term for that. But eventually the baby boom passed, and the downward trend in youth dependency resumed. The last few decades have brought a particularly strong version of the demographic dividend in American society because the smaller birth cohorts of children in those recent years have been combined with the arrival of the big baby boom cohorts at the adult ages that pay the bills in society. This combination means that youth dependency has never been lower in the United States than it was in the first decade or two of the 21st century. The idea of a virtuous spiral, a spiral upward of mutual reinforcement involving lower birth rates, lower demands for intergenerational transfers, more investment and saving, economic growth and higher living standards, and thus even lower birth rates, looks at first sight like a recipe for continual progress. But the fact is that the demographic dividend always turns out to be a temporary phenomenon. Why this must be so will be explored next. The demographic dividend and its temporary effect, or at least potential effect, on any society passing through the demographic transition might call to mind a very similar story from the Old Testament. In the 41st chapter of Genesis, we read that Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up." Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 lean, ugly cows that come up afterwards are 7 years. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." These verses pretty well sum up the effects of the demographic dividend. The 7 fat cows are the period when the dwindling numbers of children from lower birth rates free up more of the adult population's take-home pay to be used for consumption and investment, which stimulates the economy, and for savings, which allow the economy to grow and raise the standard of living. But once birth rates reach the stable low level that often comes at the end of the demographic transition, the party is over, and the 7 scrawny, ugly cows come up out of the river. Why does this happen? What puts an end to the demographic dividend? Everything seemed to be going so well. The problem is that eventually those smaller birth cohorts produced by the fertility decline grow up and turn into the adult working age population. The contraction of population that looked so good when it involved young dependents turns into a contraction of the labor force that is supposed to be paying the bills. At the same time, those larger generations who had the fewer children to start with and who enjoyed the growth and prosperity accompanying the demographic dividend start reaching old age. Eventually, the share of the total population found in the working ages drifts back down again to just about the level where we found it before the dividend first came on the scene. And just like Joseph's advice to the Pharaoh, any society that passes through the demographic transition should be alert to the opportunity of those 7 fat cows, that brief period of a decade or two when they enjoy a higher than normal share of the population in the working ages. If they use this advantage well, they can enjoy accelerated economic growth, rising prosperity, and hopefully save and invest some of this economic harvest for the lean and ugly cows that will follow as smaller cohorts enter the labor force and the share of older people begins to increase. The total dependency ratio in a population simply adds together the youth dependency ratio and the aged dependency ratio. The share of the total population in the working ages, which is the crucial measure of whether you're enjoying a demographic dividend or not, depends on both of these populations of dependents, not only on the share of youth dependents. Of course, we're oversimplifying the situation when we pretend that everyone under some age, such as 15 or 19, is a dependent. It is even more unrealistic to say that everyone over some age, such as 65 or 70, is an elderly dependent. There are some people in each of these so-called dependent age ranges who are economically active, working, contributing to the economy and producing wealth. At the same time, we make the opposite error if we assume that everyone in the so-called working ages is in fact employed in the paid labor force and contributing to the national product of a society. Some working age people are disabled. Some others have roles like housewives that do not directly produce earnings or tax revenues, and there are also people who are unemployed and looking for work but cannot find a job. There are other people who may not have any actual earned income, but who still enjoy the benefits of profits on their investments of inherited wealth. If they pay any taxes on this unearned income, they are also employed rather than dependents, no matter how old they are. If we take all these details of actual work status into account, we would get a slightly different value for the dependency ratio, comparing all dependents to all employed persons. But the simple age boundaries that demographers use to define young and old dependent ages versus working ages also give us a useful perspective on how the problem of intergenerational transfers is affected by the age structure changes caused by the demographic transition. There is no particular mathematical reason why the dependency ratio at the end of the transition should return to approximately the same level that it had before the transition started. But in fact, this seems to be what usually happens. The downward slide of the youth dependency ratio turns out to be just about matched by the rise in the elderly dependent ratio in the long run. Prior to the start of the transition, nearly all dependents are children. For example, in the United States in 1900, before its demographic transition, there were at least 8 dependents under age 20 for every 1 dependent over age 70. It's unlikely that this ratio would ever actually reverse so that there are 8 old people for every child. This could only result from a birth rate so low that the population would disappear completely in a generation or two. But the sum of the 2 dependent populations ends up just about where it began, at just under half of the total population. We can see this in the case of Canada, where the demographic transition was completed some decades ago. Prior to the transition, there were about 90 dependents, combining young and old together, for every 100 working-age people. In other words, slightly less than half the population. By the end of the transition, Canada was right back where it had started, at about 85 dependents per 100 working-age people, and still climbing back toward the 90 level. This time, the 90 dependents for each 100 workers would combine about 55 older and 35 younger dependents, instead of 10 older and 80 younger dependents as at the start. This rebalancing of the dependency ratio at the old pre-transition level wipes out the temporary benefits of having more workers and fewer dependents. Hopefully Canada and other societies going through this process recognize the 7 fat cows when they see them, and also recognize that all good things must come to an end. John Ross spells out some of these benefits of the temporary demographic dividend. One main result is simply that with fewer children around, there will be less consumption spending on everything from food to sneakers to visits with the dentist or piano lessons. The other side of the coin of lower birth rates also often appears as more women employed in full-time paying jobs, making them part of the employed population rather than dependents in the middle of the working ages. There are also other side effects of lower birth rates, including better health for women in the reproductive ages in particular. The total amount of income for families increases, and the costs of spending on children decreases. The result is almost certain to be more saving and investment, which in turn will expand the volume of capital available for economic expansion. This all begins to look more and more like those 7 fat cows, and it is no longer so surprising to hear that when countries in Southeast Asia, such as Singapore and Malaysia, enjoyed the demographic dividend in the latter part of the last century, as much as a third of their astonishing economic growth has been linked to that temporary sweet spot in the dependency ratio. But Ross makes one additional crucial point to which we turn next. This economic mini-boom linked to the demographic dividend is only a potential benefit of transition. Like any dividend, it only reinforces and accelerates growth if you take the dividend and reinvest it in the business that produced it. If you take your demographic dividend and fritter it away instead of reinvesting it, you can't expect to be any better off in the long run as a result. We understand what is at least a potential economic windfall that is built into the middle of the demographic transition. It might be a little frustrating to have John Ross tell us that it is only a potential, and that it would be quite possible to squander the opportunity and come out at the end of the transition with nothing to show for it. In point of fact, the worst case scenario is actually more serious than that. Not only can the demographic dividend be wasted, but if it is, this can actually do more harm than good in a country going through the transition. After all, a rising share of the population in the working ages, particularly the young working ages, only translates into economic gains if these young adults are actually working, that is, if they can find jobs. In any number of developing countries around the world, where kin-based patronage and powerful entrenched elites still jealously guard their control over as many as possible of the levers of control over the economy, the influx of more and more young workers into cities in search of careers can mean trouble instead of an economic miracle. When all of these potentially productive young adults can't find the jobs that could boost the whole economy and the whole society, their frustration and idleness can flow into quite different channels. For example, many of the populations of the Middle East, where the Arab Spring plunged country after country into political chaos and sometimes violent regime change, also were in the midst of fertility declines and were enjoying their own potential demographic dividends. But the governments of these countries could not find paths for all these young and energetic people to find productive economic roles and careers. They were stuck in kin-based patronage systems with only limited potential for incorporating a rapidly expanding labor force. The results in many cases were not just a missed chance for rapid economic growth, but actual economic disruption and a step or two backwards in the development process. Ross emphasizes that in order to realize the potential of a demographic dividend, any society must be able to harness the new potential for economic productivity. This means, first of all, that the working age population must be able to go to work, rather than getting stuck in some kind of unproductive, dependent status in the midst of the working ages. In particular, to take full advantage of the lower birth rates that produce declining dependency ratios, the women who have delayed marriages and spaced out their births need to have a path into productive economic activity. Every woman in the childbearing age who enters the paid labor force in these countries subtracts herself from the numerator of dependents and adds herself to the denominator of employed persons at the same time, a double whammy of economic advantage not only for herself but for the society as a whole. If we consider the populations of already developed countries like the United States, Japan, or Germany that have already completed their demographic transitions, and who are looking at their demographic dividends in the rear view mirror, we see high rates of employment for both men and women particularly in the tertiary or service sector where economic growth is often the fastest. The primary or agricultural sector, where large-scale new employment opportunities can be scarce, has shrunk to an extremely tiny fraction of the total labor force. The total share of adults in the labor force in these countries looks low compared to the 4 less developed countries in the chart, but that is because the International Labor Organization publishes this labor force data only for all adults above age 15 or age 25. In the United States, and especially in Germany and Japan, this includes a large elderly population no longer in the labor force. A lot of the gap between these bars showing employment and the top of the graph is occupied by the elderly population in these countries, actually illustrating that they no longer enjoy any demographic dividend. In Malaysia, Peru, and Pakistan, the total size of the male labor force adds up to a bigger share of the adult population, because they're in the middle of the dividend period, and the elderly population has not yet started to expand. In Peru in particular, women also have a high employment level. But the gender gap is bigger in Malaysia and truly enormous in Pakistan, where hardly any women have paying jobs and nearly all of them work in agriculture. This means that Pakistan is passing up a large part of its potential economic growth. There will be fewer than 7 of the fat, healthy cows appearing there, and more ugly, skinny cows following close behind them later. Finally, as we'll see again in a moment, Nigeria still has not really entered its own demographic dividend period. The total share of the adult population with paying jobs is about as low as in the developed countries, but without any large elderly population. This clearly illustrates the inability of a kin-based patronage economy to find employment for all its working-age adults. So the prospect of a coming demographic dividend there may not be the good news one might take it for at first. What is the best way for a country about to see its 7 fat cows coming up out of the river? How can the society take advantage of the extra share of its population concentrated in these productive ages? How can they be sure that the jobs will be there for them? This is pretty much the master question for which every country is seeking the ultimate answer, so you can be sure there are a lot of people offering answers. John Ross briefly shares what we might describe as the mainstream opinion about this route to success with the dividend. The key, of course, is to have enough capital available to grow all the businesses that will employ that large working-age population. Even Malthus was aware of the central role of capital in economic progress. But how to get it? Most of the existing capital in the world is already concentrated in the most developed countries. So really the only way for a developing country in the middle of its demographic transition to get hold of enough of it to expand quickly and employ their demographic dividend requires them to encourage foreign trade and investment. In other words, to actively join the world economy and participate in what is commonly called globalization. Some people view this as a negative choice in the long term because these developing economies usually have trouble to compete in open competition with the developed countries. If a society does manage its economy well enough and attracts enough capital to take advantage of the special demographic dividend accompanying fertility decline, Ross has some further advice for the best way to use the resulting expansion of wealth. The country that reinvests the profits of growth in better education and health care will not only improve the productivity of labor, but will also reinforce the trend toward lower birth rates and reduce mortality of women in the bargain so that they're available for more years of adulthood to make continuing contributions to the society. But all of these highly recommended expenditures on services for the population are only possible if the underlying foundation of economic growth and modernization is also successful. And that goes back directly to sufficient capital to employ as much of the unusually large labor force as possible. As already hinted at earlier, developed countries like the United States, Japan, or Germany already enjoyed their demographic dividend in the last couple of decades of the 20th century, in some cases extending for a few years into the new century. By now, most of the developed world is climbing the reverse slope up out of the low dependency ratios of the dividend period as the new small generations produced by low fertility reach the working ages, and their still numerous parents begin to retire and become elderly dependents. Other parts of the world are working their way through this same temporary dip in the dependency burden, with East Asian countries like China and Korea about a generation behind Europe and North America, and then Southeast and Southern Asia, where the low point of the dividend period has just begun in recent years and will continue for the next decade or so. The outlier in this series remains the African continent, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where the dependency ratio currently remains very much higher than in any other part of the world, largely because the fertility transition has barely begun in many African nations, so the smaller birth cohorts that usher in the phenomenon are hardly even in sight yet. Population projections for the continent have made assumptions about how birth rates eventually will decline, but there's no guarantee that this actually will happen, and that the dependency burden will begin to decline later in this century, as sometimes suggested. Even if it does, we need to keep in mind that a higher share of a population concentrated in the working ages only amounts to a dividend for the society if those people in the working ages can find work. So there are still a lot of questions about a demographic dividend for Africa.